Good evening and a very warm welcome to all. I welcome you on behalf of Flame University to Connections, connecting the dots with an interdisciplinary approach. This webinar, our sixth webinar, is about unbundling creative potential. And I invite Professor Neeraj Mankar, our moderator, to please introduce our speaker. Professor Neeraj Mankar is the Assistant Dean Programs and Faculty in the area of Strategies and Operations. Sir, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Benita, for that kind thing. Let me first warmly welcome each one of you once again, all the attendees who have joined us, and a very special welcome to Professor Ramnath. And it's a great privilege to introduce him because he is a very senior faculty in the department here at Flame University. But more than that, he is a great leadership development. He's a frequent contributor in multiple talks that we do in Flame. And he holds a PhD in economics and sociology from Ecole, D.E.A, Etudes, and Sciences Sociales. I hope I got my French right, sir. From Paris, France, and he he's a distinguished professor here at Flame. And before he joined Flame University, he has been associated with great institutions like IIM Bangalore, the Gokhale Institute of Political Economy and Politics and Economy, and School of Advanced Studies in Social Sciences in Paris. Professor Ramnath has also was a visiting research fellow in the Center for Russian and East European Studies at University of Birmingham, which was supported by the Rockefeller Foundation. And his areas of interests very broadly are in business and society, economic reforms, spirituality, and self-development and development. But this is the official introduction which we give of Professor Ramnath. But let me give you some things which he's an outstanding faculty when it comes to areas of leadership, creativity, and multiple interpersonal related areas at Flame. And I'm sure, sir, that your talk today will be wonderful to listen, and I'm glad that I'm getting an opportunity to sit through this as well. So without further ado, sir, thank you very much once again from all of us here, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Neeraj, for that very kind and flattering introduction. I'm indeed grateful to be present here this evening to address a distinguished audience. And I thank everybody for having given me that rare opportunity to do so. Let me get to the heart of what I want to say this evening. I'm often asked several times in the course of my career, sometimes by students, sometimes by practicing managers, sometimes by colleagues, sometimes by friends, what, Professor, is the purpose of life? And I normally answer and respond to that question in two parts. But before I get there, I would like to share a few thoughts, three principal thoughts that set the background that will enable the listener to appreciate the response that's given to that question. In the world that we inhabit today, sadly, the space for innocence and spontaneity has drastically reduced. This is, of course, the result of a variety of reasons and factors. primarily because of an information overload that we experience today, and partly because of many other factors. However, the fact remains that the space for innocence has been drastically diminished. Spontaneity, creative thinking, the capacity to imagine has been replaced by a terrific dependence on the computer, on surfing the net, acquiring more information, and so on. So this has resulted in some negative consequences, and we shall address them shortly and also suggest ways and means of reversing the tide. The second, I agree with the Greek philosopher Socrates, who once said that a life that is not constantly examined and re-examined is one that's not worth living. It's a very beautiful and profound statement. It means that this great blessing that we have been given, the blessing of life, must be nurtured, must be seen as something very precious, something invaluable that the Almighty has given us. And we need to nurture that with ownership and responsibility. And therefore, the qualities of reflection, introspection, and contemplation are critical to making this happen. We always need to examine and re-examine the assumptions that we make in the world every day, to see whether they are validated or invalidated. And if they are invalidated, to have the courage to give them up and replace them with assumptions, philosophies, convictions, beliefs that are relevant and market contestable. The third is, of course, creativity is the original natural resource. It is the one inimitable quality that makes us genuinely human. The capacity to reinvent, the capacity to reimagine, the capacity to rediscover is what has moved progress and development in this planet ever since we came to inhabit it. So it's a precious quality, and it is in our interest to understand this quality. And how do we nurture it? How do we rein it to serve a larger, superior purpose? To come back to the question that I had asked in the beginning, what is the purpose of life? Well, in some respects, the first answer to that question surely is the purpose of life is to elevate conversation around you and move that to an ever-increasing higher plane of consciousness, to bring positive energy wherever we go, to bring the idea of positive affirmation, that we must live with a desire to spread the radiance of positive energy wherever we go. A creative mind helps you to make that happen. So the first response to that question is, of course, to elevate conversation. There is, of course, another dimension to it. As we grow from childhood to becoming a young adult, and we learn to navigate life in multiple ways, in multiple domains, we begin to realize that the world is not just made up of two colors of black and white, that truth cannot be defined in terms of just black and white. But the reality of that we confront and engage every day is that life is made up of a multitude of colors. There's green, gray, yellow, black. And we need to negotiate each one of them with precision, with intelligence, effectively, in order to live a life that is fulfilling, that meets our internal and external needs. So the second purpose I would describe of life is that in this wide world, composed of a disconcerting multiplicity of colors and challenges, individually, as an individual, the primary challenge in front of us is to find what works for us. What works for you? So what works for me may not necessarily work for somebody else, or still somebody else. My principal challenge in this world is to find what works for me. And this takes time. It requires patience to develop an insight. It requires exposure. It requires expanding our mental horizons, our intellectual horizons, expanding our consciousness in a way that becomes inclusive and that remains in consonance with some of the great truths described in our scriptures, especially the two epics of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, and the sacred Bhagavad Gita, which is to remain fidel to Dharma and to Satyam, or truth. Dharma, of course, has many meanings, but in the context that I'm using it here, it means righteousness. And Dharma can be defined very simply, without controversy, as any thought, any idea, any action, any speech that promotes harmony in the universe is dharmic. Anything that contributes to bring about harmony in the world promotes dharma. Truth is, however, a different matter because it's very subjective. What is true to me may not necessarily be what is true to you. So we have to, and so our scriptures inform us, be fidel to our own dharma. The dharma of a thief is to steal. The dharma of a teacher is to instruct. The dharma of a policeman is law enforcement, and so on. So we need to keep, I want you to keep these two thoughts, these two insights as a background. As we grow into adulthood, we discover that we need different kinds of intelligence to support the process of growing up. I call these territories enormous. And broadly speaking, there are 6 levels of intelligence that we need to consciously and deliberately cultivate. The first may loosely be described as analytical intelligence, which is largely related to the head. And as we grow into becoming employable, productive citizens of the nation, it deals primarily with the workplace. For example, when you work in a university or in a company or an institution, you're paid for your buddhi. You're paid for your capacity to analyze. And that's why it's called analytical intelligence. It refers to a mastery of tools and techniques that you learn in school, college, and university. The second that came to occupy importance sometime after 1998 is called emotional intelligence. It was pioneered by a scholar called Daniel Goleman from Harvard University, who produced this outstanding work called Emotional Intelligence, where he argued that, and today in a series of articles in Harvard Business Review, ever since the publication of that book, he today argues justifiably that leaders become leaders, effective leaders, only when they are high in emotional intelligence. So just as we have something called IQ, the intelligence quotient, to measure analytical intelligence, today we have several products in the market that can successfully teach us how to measure EIQ, or what is known as emotional intelligence quotient. The third is, of course, spiritual intelligence. And this came especially in the world to dominate the world of management, starting from the year 2000. Spiritual intelligence is the inner unfoldment of the self. It assumes that the external part of you does not necessarily correspond to the internal part of you. Consider the saying in English that all Appearances are deceptive. So spiritual intelligence refers to the conquering of the inside, the conquering of your inner self. There are three more intelligences that have been written about in the literature in the past 10, 15 years. One is social intelligence, which refers to our capacity to engage in productive social relationships at multiple levels, at multiple domains. The fifth is cultural intelligence, which refers to the milieu. And the sixth is inner intelligence, which refers to our capacity to develop intuition and empathy for other human beings who live in the world with us. So broadly speaking, growing up is about developing these 6 sets of intelligence. And if we are able to do this in a conscious, deliberate way, that's even better. The one quality that helps us navigating these sets of intelligence is, of course, creativity. So the first question that we need to ask ourselves is, what is creativity? And how is it distinguishable from innovation? What is the difference between the two? Creativity, broadly speaking, is about moving away from the standard way of doing things. It refers to the production of often novel and brilliant ideas at a disconcerting pace. Some people are enormously gifted. Consider the world of the arts, the performing arts, and different art expressions. Excuse me. The famous music composer, Ludwig Beethoven, started playing the piano at the young age of 6, maybe even earlier. And he was responsible for producing 9 of the finest symphonies the world has ever known. But it is also true that he was stone deaf. But that did not prevent him from producing great music. The great painter, Picasso, towards the latter half of his life, when he was almost in his 80s, he was interviewed by a French journalist in Paris, where he was staying. And he said, the journalist asked him, Mr. Picasso, you just scratch a few lines on a piece of paper and you charge several $100s for it. Is that fair? And he gave a very beautiful answer to the journalist. He said, you know, it took me 80 years to learn to paint like a child. What an extraordinary answer. What an extraordinary statement. So creativity is a mental process. It refers to our capacity to produce ideas, novel ideas, brilliant ideas, breakaway ideas at a stupendous pace. Innovation, on the other hand, is not a mental process. It is about taking the creative process to its logical conclusion so that it results in the creation of a new good, a new service, or a new product. So it's not enough to be just creative, which is something that's relatively easy to do. Every day in our lives, every single day, we use our creative imagination to negotiate the world we live in, to navigate it. But we're not always innovative. Innovative is to take that idea, take ownership and responsibility for the idea, and develop it into a product that is of universal value, universal benefit, where people can benefit, human beings can benefit by using it. So one is a process, the other is a noun. One refers to an ability, the other refers to a thing. So they are two different things. A few more remarks on why creativity is not innovation. As I said, creativity is something abstract. It refers to a mental process, largely confined to the mind. On the other hand, innovation is something concrete. Creativity is a mental process. Innovation is about a good, the production of a good, a service, or a product. It is easy to be creative. It is difficult to innovate. Creativity challenges ideas, especially existing ideas. It challenges the status quo. Innovations provide solutions. Creativity needs discipline. If it is not fettered, if it is unfettered, it can result in undesirable consequences. On the other hand, innovation requires effort. Creativity, finally, is essentially about ideation, your capacity to ideate, whereas innovation is about invention. What can we do to unleash this creative potential within us? The Almighty was not partial when he created us. The creative facility is given to all without exception. But very few take up the challenge of actually nurturing it. Is there any way in which we can nurture that? Take ownership and responsibility for developing it as a skill, as something that will enhance the quality of our lives. Over a period of 20-25 years, I have been dealing with practicing managers, holding workshops with managers, with companies, with institutions on the subject of creativity and innovation. And I have developed or tried to formulate 10 golden rules, which I have formulated in the course of my life, in the process of engaging with challenges that I myself faced. In the course of my professional life, if I may strike a personal note, I had to reinvent myself thrice. And reinvention is not an easy thing to do. It means to give up everything that you held as sacred and sacrosanct, to have the courage to give it up when challenged, and you're not able to defend it, to give that up and replace it with knowledge that is relevant, market contestable, and real. I did this 3 times in my life. And just as a matter of fact, I was successful each time I did it. But I would like to share with you, what I would like to share with you is I would not have minded a whit if I had failed. In India, we tend to have a very pejorative view of failure. Actually, failure is one of the biggest gifts given to human beings by the Almighty. It is a way of his signaling to us that I'm pushing you along the green light all the time. And yet each time you reject my advice and my counsel and push yourself into the red light zone. So it is a process of correction. Failure, we experience failure because that's nature's way of instructing us that we're not on the right path. We need to take self-corrective action. So the purpose of failure, therefore, is to make amends, to learn the right lessons from it. And when we learn the right lessons from it, we take the first step in a journey of 1,000 miles. We take the first step. So the true purpose of failure is therefore success. So failure, we must be grateful to the Almighty for having given us that quality. Failure is meant to instruct. It is, in other words, the biggest guru. Whenever we are asked, what does the term guru mean? We often say experience. We euphemistically describe it as experience. Actually, the biggest what gives us the biggest trigger of all knowledge and wisdom is pain. What we euphemistically refer as experience. It is pain that is the biggest teacher. And it is not without reason that the planet Saturn, in India he is known as Shani. Almost there is probably no Indian who is not afraid of this name. But the planet Saturn, the planet Shani, is one of the greatest because he's the planet of wisdom. He gives wisdom through pain, makes sure that you never forget it, and makes sure that you never repeat that mistake again. If you ignore that counsel, you ignore it at your own peril. So to come back to what I was saying, is there some way in which we can, are there any rules that we can follow, any guidelines that we can set ourselves to embark on this journey of exploring the creative potential that is present within us? So over the course of my career, I've formulated 10 guidelines. So let me share that with you this evening. The first essential rule of unbundling creative potential is to learn to become a child without being childish. Children are worshipped in all the major wisdom traditions of the world. There is no wisdom tradition that does not worship children, that does not laud them. Yes, there's a very beautiful parable in one of the versions of the New Testament. If I remember right, I think it occurs in the Gospel according to St. Matthew, where Jesus is sitting under a tree and a couple of children come running because somebody has told them that God is sitting under that tree. And if they want to see God, they need to go to that tree and see Jesus. Being children, having no baggage, mental baggage to burden them, they say, let's go and see God. So a couple of them come walking very purposefully towards the tree under which Jesus is sitting. And Jesus, as usual, is surrounded by his apostles. What do you think the function of apostles is the world over? Whenever I ask this question, people tell me to spread the message of the master. And I tell them that's not the purpose. They do exactly the opposite because they prevent access to the master. And that's what these apostles did to the children. They started shooing them away and saying, don't come here, don't disturb him. You're too young, go away. Jesus heard them. His own apostles preventing access to him, to these little children. And these were his exact words. He said, do not prevent their access to me because the kingdom of God belongs to he who has the mentality of a child. It's a very beautiful sentence, very beautiful teaching, a very beautiful insight, because it means what he was really telling them is, if your minds are not as pure and as pristine and as innocent as those of these little children, you have no place in my kingdom. So in life, the first rule of exploring creative potential is to learn to treat life and receive life with humility. To be struck, which is to be humble, is to get up every day with a sense of wonderment, puzzle, excitement, and joy at this remarkable world that we live in. We should never lose that quality. Unfortunately, as we grow and mature into adults, we kill the child in us. So the first golden rule of unbundling creative potential is to preserve that child, is to preserve that childlike way of viewing the universe around us, not to be inhibited by strong assumptions, beliefs, biases, and prejudices, but to have an open mind like that of an innocent child. The second is to develop, which is very closely related to the first, is to develop a childlike approach to learning, not impeded by either ego, identity, or fear. Children are children because they don't have these three things. They're not strong on the ego because it's not yet developed. Second, very little sense of identity in contrast to matured adults. And third, fearless. These three qualities are qualities of spontaneity and innocence. We love children because of their smile. We love children because of their absence of guile. We love children because of their absence of fear. So to have an approach to learning that is childlike, because these are the three major, ladies and gentlemen, enemies of learning. Ego, the sense that I know everything, nobody can teach me anything. The second, identity. Goodness me, I am the CEO, I am the chief executive officer of this company. How dare anybody have the guts to teach me what I need to do? This is identity. When we are excessively attached to our sociological identity. And the third is fear, because what human beings don't understand, they typically fear. So we need to stay away from these three enemies of learning. Before I move on to the third, I would like to say a few remarks, pass a few remarks on what is learning. Any idea what is learning? Whenever I'm asked this question, I'm given all kinds of answers. Learning is about scholarship. Learning is about reading books. Learning is about knowledge, and so on and so on. I'm afraid learning has got nothing to do with all this. The brutal truth of the matter is learning is actually about unlearning. At college, we unlearn much of what we were taught at school. At university, we unlearn much of what we were taught at college. And when we go into real life and take up a job in a company or an institution, we find that much of what we learned at school, university, and college have very little relevance to what we actually do in the job. So learning is about replacing knowledge that has become outdated and having the capacity to reject it and replace it with knowledge that is real, relevant, and market contestable. This is learning. And we must have the courage to do that, not hold on to beliefs that are not grounded in reality, that are not tenable when they are subject to a closer examination. The third golden rule is about creative potential, is to combine roles, functions, and domains in their simultaneity. Let me take an example from management because that is the domain on which I'm most familiar. And I was working for 30 years in an institution where I was involved in management education. The discipline of management has several domains: marketing, sales, IT, social sciences, economics, and so on and so on and so on. Production, supply chain. It's not enough to be good only at marketing. If you want to be a good manager today, you must have basic knowledge of every single domain of management. You don't have to be an Einstein in each one of those domains, but you must have basic knowledge. You must know enough of marketing to know what you don't know. You must have enough legal knowledge to draw up a contract. So basic concepts that are intrinsic to every domain of management is something that a manager should be familiar with, combining roles, functions, and domains in their simultaneity. You must not take the attitude that I'm an accountant, so I have nothing to do with marketing, so I don't need to know anything about it. That is being insular and one-sided. the more fully developed you are in that discipline, the better informed decisions you take. The fourth is our capacity to institutionalize doubt and accept being challenged. Democracy, ladies and gentlemen, to me is nothing but the institutionalization of doubt. It is a political philosophy that treats doubt as a legitimate philosophical posture. In the same way, our capacity to institutionalize doubt and accept being challenged is an essential ingredient of the creative process. We must have the ability to welcome challenge. If we don't have that ability, you may claim to be a tiger, but you're made only of paper. Strength must be proved. Strength must be tested if it is real. And challenges in life need to be confronted, engaged, positively engaged, in order to grow, in order to develop, in order to elevate ourselves. So that is the fourth. The fifth is defining your North Star by deriving energy from appreciative inquiry and deep questioning. Your North Star is your passion in life. It is intimately related to your purpose and meaning that you have constructed in your life. It is about your life's calling. In Hindi, there's a very beautiful word that describes it. हर व्यक्ति के जिंदगी में एक पुकार होती है. There is a calling that keeps nagging, that keeps nudging an individual to go and greet it, to go and meet it, to go and embrace it. We call this North Star. So defining your North Star by deriving positive energy from two things. One, appreciative inquiry, which is a way of viewing the world and its challenges. And the other, and deep questioning. Deep questioning refers to the fears that you do not want to have. It is in between these two poles that self-development takes place, that self-articulation takes place. And that is why they are so essential that we develop them. The next golden principle is viewing past successes as positive impediments to the future. This is, I'm afraid some people may find this harsh, but it's true. You may have been a person, a man or a woman of considerable accomplishment in your younger years. You may have been a gold medalist. You may have emerged or stood first in your engineering college. You may have had a lot of accomplishments to your credit in the first 10 years of your working life. You must not allow your head to be sullen by these accomplishments. You must not allow your ego and develop the 10 heads of a Ravana when you look at your accomplishments. Because those accomplishments were valid for their time, their space, and their historical setting. Today, the reason why I say that is the world is always in a dynamic state of flux. The external context is always subject to change every minute, every second. And therefore, we need to have the capacity to adapt to changing circumstance. So we must have the capacity, therefore, of viewing past successes as something that was relevant for their time and circumstance. But they may not be necessarily relevant today. Today, you have to look at the entire context de nouveau, to treat it as an empty slate and start thinking anew. The next is also intimately related to the previous one. Breaking the image we have of ourselves, because it is precisely this image that puts us on autopilot. All of us have a self-image. I think, for example, that if I ask you to define yourselves with 3 attributes at least, you will say, I'm a very honest person. I'm a very hardworking person. I'm a very diligent person, and so on and so on and so on. There's nothing wrong in having a self-image. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. The problem is that we absolutize these images. We think that these images are inflexible, that they are somehow beyond change. And we hold on to them for dear life. This is when I have problems with it. If you do this, then very often what happens is you go into what I call autopilot behavior. If you take a flight, for example, from Poona to Delhi, as the aircraft approaches Jaipur, the aircraft begins its descent, the pilot begins his descent. And at that time, he switches the plane onto autopilot. And it is the plane navigating itself, thanks to the extraordinary technology that is there at his disposal. Everything is mechanized. Most of us, unfortunately, live our lives on autopilot behavior. We are too predictable. And what I mean by this is we need to get out of autopilot behavior and take conscious charge of our lives. You must learn to steer the aircraft of our lives consciously, deliberately, and navigate it with full awareness and not go into autopilot behavior. You must not absolutize the qualities that make up your self-image. You must accept the fact that they are open to change, susceptible to change, and indeed they must change over time. The last two, having the courage to be vulnerable by acknowledging what we do not have. I have dealt with managers from the IT industry for several years now, several decades actually. And a lot of them used to come up to me and say, Professor, people like you live in an ivory tower. You're asking us to expose our vulnerability to our bosses. How do we know that that will not be misused? And so on and so on and so on. Very often they forget. People like hearing the truth. When you are forthright and when you're truthful, people actually appreciate it because they know they're not being fooled. They're not being given an impression of something who you are not in reality. So, having the courage to be vulnerable by acknowledging what we do not have. If your boss is asks you a question and you don't know the answer, you should be humble enough to say, sir, I don't know, but I'll make sure that I'll work very hard the next day or two to come up with an answer, to find out and come back to you and revert to you. There's nothing wrong with that. The earth doesn't collapse if that happens. And the last is having the courage to disable the roots of our incompetencies, our core incompetencies. The famous management thinker, C.K. Prahlad, used to visit IIM Bangalore quite often 2 decades ago. And he was a great thinker in strategy, the area of strategy. He coined the term core competence. By core competence, C.K. Prahlad did not refer to a product or a service or a good. He referred to a basket of skills that contribute to making the company inimitable in the marketplace. That the company should have something distinctive about it, about the way it operates, not just about its products, but about the processes, the systems that it has that are unique only to it and that are nurtured in-house, that contribute to keep it competitive in the marketplace. Just as C.K. Prahlad spoke about core competence in relation to companies, I use the term core incompetence in the context of practicing managers. And by that, I mean that all of us are a bundle of both core competencies and incompetencies. We have certain good qualities about us. We also have certain qualities that pull us down. And the secret of unbundling creative potential is a function of two things. One, the necessity to first identify what our core barriers are. How do you identify a core barrier, and what is a core barrier? Any repetitive pattern of behavior, I repeat, any repetitive pattern of behavior that robs you of positive energy is a core barrier. It could be anger, it could be impatience, it could refer to any number of things. And if you are able to reflect and isolate the core barriers that inhibit you from living up to potential, that is the first step to disabling it. There are two steps involved. First, identifying what your core barriers are. And if you look at the net today and surf the net, you'll find a disconcerting multiplicity of products that are available in this domain, which help you to identify what your core barriers are. The second step, of course, is to disable it. So in these past 30 years, these are some of the rules that I have formulated based on my own experience of how we can unbundle creative potential that is present in every single human being. A lot of things have been given to us by the Almighty. But in order to find those things, we need to delve into them, consciously make the effort to unbundle them, develop them, nurture them with a sense of ownership and responsibility. In this lecture that we have tried to capture some of the major elements that will help each individual unbundle his or her own creative potential. Finally, let me close with the thought stemming from Theodore Levitt. If I remember rightly, he used to be one of the editors of the Harvard Business Review and was famous for a beautiful article that he wrote there on distinguishing between creativity and innovation. And he said creativity is thinking up new things. As I said, it is a mental process, while innovation is doing new things. One is thinking, the other is doing. Thank you very much for your kind attention, ladies and gentlemen. I'll be happy to take up any questions that you might have and answer them to the best of my ability. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you, sir. I think that was very interesting. I have a few questions, but I'm going to leave it. Let me get first some questions coming in from the audiences.
Sure.
Anyone, please go ahead and put in your questions in the Q&A section. We'll be taking it up with Professor Ramnath right away. But before the question actually starts coming in, sir, I think when I went through your presentation, there was, the last, during the last part of the slides, you mentioned about past success being impediments to failure, past successes as impediments to failure. So that was quite interesting. I think we normally thought that the other way would be, you think if you fail too often, then you don't have the urge, or you think you can't succeed. I'm just intrigued that how would successes become impediments to failures?
It's a good question. I'm often asked this. Whenever I speak about this, this is inevitably one of the questions that come. How can you describe a success as a failure? Well, the moment, my answer is pretty straightforward. The moment you discover why you have failed and you understand why you have failed, it no longer becomes a failure. You have taken the road to transforming that failure into success. So actually, we don't disagree. The problem is that with us, with most human beings, we are attached to the experience. We are not attached to the insight I'm saying develop attachment to the insight. What did you learn from that failure rather than the experience?
Sure.
On that day, the blue sky was blue and the green grass was green. That's irrelevant. That's got nothing to do with anything. What did you learn from that failure? Have you now set it right? Have you understood why you failed? The moment you do that, you get onto a transformation agenda.
Right.
And that becomes your present. It's no longer your past.
Right.
Because that is in your living memory. It is part of your living present. That's what I mean. So we actually don't differ from each other.
Thank you. There's a question from one of the attendees here. Ajit ji asks how to overcome the factor that stops creativity becoming innovation. How we think to change a habit, but we fail to do so. How do you correct that?
Look, there was a time in my life when I was younger where I used to enjoy alcohol. And of course, I never overdid it, but I used to love the stuff. If I could afford it, I would love to have it every day and drink the most expensive booze that I could get. I would also love to smoke the best cigarettes that I could command and that I could afford. And like most people who get addicted to addictive substances, you're seldom aware of the harm that it does or the damage that it does to you. And you just carry on regardless. Till your body tells you and starts giving you signals that, hey, you know what, you need to change course. So you have two options there. You either ignore it and say, oh, I'm not going to worry about it. The other is to heed that advice. So whenever you are on a path of transformation, if you take the right decisions, if you have the right attitude, if you are genuine about that transformation, nature itself will conspire to make your dreams happen. That has been my experience. But when you resist her, and when you go against the messages that you get, and continue willfully to do the wrong thing, then you have to pay that price. So the critical thing there is to see the red light at the right time and to take corrective action. And in my case, that went on for quite some time till I had a meeting with my Guruji in 2007. And on the very first day, I met him on 28th of July, 2007. And it changed my life. I was in my early 40s, middle 40s, and he was practically half my age. He was 27. And the last question that he asked me was, do you have addictive habits? And I said, yes, I smoke and I drink to distraction. And I don't feel bad about it. And he said, you have to change that because that will rob you of positive energy. And within the next 45 days, he made me give up both. And I never touched it again after that. And then I found in experience that there were mountains of positive energy that were entering my system, which I never thought I was capable of. So when you start experiencing those good effects and those positive outcomes, that puts you very firmly on the path of self-transformation. So to answer your question, self-development or the capacity to transform, you require a certain subtlety of mind and a certain suppleness of intellect to read subtle signals given to you in your daily life to change for the better. You must learn to sense those intuitively, sharpen your intuition to grasp those warning signs and take action upon them.
Thank you. Just looking, we have a couple of minutes more. So in case any one of you would like to ask more questions, I'm just going to, sir, ask you one last question, I think,
Sure.
which is coming from the Q&A box, that in our day-to-day lives as executives or working, how do we imbibe and live through what all you have spoken about. And because it's difficult to walk the talk, I'm just adding my own 2 bits here.
Sure.
Difficult to walk the talk, but any tips that you could give us to make that possible?
The tips I have already given. What I can share with you is my own personal experience. I told you in the beginning of the talk that in this world, you have to find what works for you. What works for me may not work for you. May not. Chances are it may not. Why? Because all human beings are uniquely constructed. Every single human being is a unique product. He's a product of his history, his environment, his inheritance. Each of one are radically different from each other. So in my case, I struggled a fair amount. And my way of solving it is, I went very deeply in 1999. I decided to go into the field of spirituality. And I took a sabbatical for a year, in which I went through and investigated all the 9 major wisdom traditions of the world. So I did some very intensive reading. And that was a kind of sadhana, if you like, combined with some physical demands on the body. Took regular exercises. I read for, I think, about almost 10 to 12 hours a day. And at the end of the year 2000, I decided that what I needed was the guidance of a living master. So I went in search of one. And I did all kinds of things for which time doesn't permit me to go into depth about them. But I finally found my master, as I told you, on 28th of July. And I went and told him that I need your help because I can't do this on my own. So you see, what I learned from my own experience. The principle of Guru is the major principle of this universe. If you need to learn mathematics, well, you need a guru. You need to learn strategy, you need to go to a guru to learn it. And like everything else, spirituality too needs a guru. So I went to one and I confessed to him. I said, I went on bended knees. I said, I've been searching for years and I've not found a satisfactory answer. I need guidance. Can you help me? And when you do that, I can't think of any master refusing you. And that particular event completely changed my life. Completely, radically. So stopping drinking or smoking were the external appearances. But much more important was the changes that were taking place on the inside. And that is something only a guru can give you. So you need to search for a person wiser than you, who cares for you sufficiently enough to guide you. So each one of us, I believe, needs that. Some of us can admit to that freely. Some of us find it difficult to do that. But to me, it came very easy and it came naturally. And if I'm able to learn from somebody, if I'm convinced that I can learn something from a little child, I'm willing to touch the feet of that child. Unless you have this kind of a temperament where you can abandon your ego at will and submit it to the task of learning, you will always be a winner. But if you put your ego in front of you and allow it to become an obstacle, then you create a mountain of difficulty.
Thank you, sir. I think we can take just one last question. We've got it from Aisha, who asks, how can we develop a strong sense of self?
Through practice. You have to develop a sense of self which is independent of your ego. That's the challenge. So very often what happens is our ego gets sullen by the smallest of accomplishments. Must learn to keep a great distance from it. So let me answer this with a very famous story of Ramakrishna Paramahansa. He was once asked, how do you live in this world? It was a very genuine, heartfelt question from a devotee. And the master looked at the devotee and said, you must learn to live like a lotus in this world. The devotee didn't understand. He said, Master, I don't understand. And then the Paramahansa explained it to him. He said, you see, when you go near a lotus, you will discover that the lotus blooms and thrives in the dirtiest of water, in filth and grime. But when you come near it, not all the filth and grime prevents it from emanating a divine fragrance when you come near it. And if you notice it closely, you will find that the lotus never, although it is on the water, it never allows the water to touch it. So you must be like a lotus in this world. Your one leg should be in the water, which is the world. And by that, the Paramahansa meant the 5 senses. You must have control over those 5 senses. And the other foot should be on divinity. So you have to be, one part of you has to engage the world. The other part of you has to engage the self. It's a very beautiful answer. And then the devotee said, Master, I still don't understand. And then the Paramahansa said, have you gone to a bank? The devotee said, yes. Have you seen the cashier handle lakhs and lakhs of rupees? He said, yes. The Paramahansa said, even when the cashier distributes that money, not once does the thought occur to him that this money is mine. So there was a very beautiful insight there. Perform your actions in this world without notions of I and mine. And if you're able to realize that in practice, then everything that you do will become a seva, will become a service to yourself. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. And sir, I did say that this is the last question, but there's a question from Sadhna, whom was a very dear friend of ours, so I'm not able to say no to that. So last question here. Do you think people focus too much on appearing to be successful? I think quite an interesting one there.
Yes, of course. Because these are seductions that the world offers you. Seductions are power, position, wealth, fame, recognition. And if you ponder deeply about these, you will discover that these are all forms of Maya. They're all forms of illusion. And therefore, you need to keep a healthy distance from all that. If you take them too seriously, they will present an image of you to the outside world, which you are not in reality. And that is not a very desirable thing, because it leads to even more Maya. So the point in this world is, ironically, unfortunately, I don't like telling you this, I don't want to tell you this, but nevertheless, this is true, that irony, and it's a very big irony, very deep irony, if you will, that ironically, the biggest challenge in this world is just to be yourself, just to remain in yourself, because there are so many distractions that remove you from understanding yourself. So practice, spiritual practice, what is otherwise known as sadhana, is the purpose is designed precisely to restore you to yourself, to restore you to who you really are. So I would say practice is essential. Anything else?
No, sir, I think that was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Sir, Benita, over to you.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. With this, we come to the end of this highly stimulating and charismatic session. And I thank our speaker, Professor Ramnath Narayanaswamy and Professor D.H.E.S.S on behalf of Flame University and our audience. Please join us for our next Connections webinar on management and life lessons by Mr. B. Narayanaswamy on 27 November at 6 p.m. You can click on the link that is shared in your chat box and register yourselves. We look forward to meeting you at our next webinar. And on this beautiful quotation that Professor Ramnath ended his presentation. I will repeat that again, sir. Creativity is thinking up new things, and innovation is doing new things. So we wish everybody a very good evening ahead. Adieu until we meet again.
Thank you. Have a good evening, sir.